So a while back I made a video about the Ersatz M10 and how it was incredibly dumb and stupid. Well, I want to come forward and say that I was actually the big dumb stupid one here. Recently, thanks to Harold Biondo, I am going to shamelessly plug his Patreon because it's fantastic, I came across some new documentation that shines some additional light on the Ersatz M10 and also may have exposed a flaw in almost every single visual representation that exists of the vehicle. Now, most of the history regarding the vehicles themselves is common knowledge and is readily available for you to dig into across the internet, for instance, Tank Encyclopedia. Just know that these vehicles were created at the behest of a rather unscrupulous individual named Otto Skorzeny, and were intended for his rather overly ambitious infiltration plan called Operation Greif. What I primarily want to talk about is the technical side of these vehicles and how they actually could have been a nightmare incarnate for the American GI during the Battle of the Bulge. I will go ahead and state that my primary source of information for this video is the European Theater of Operations Ordnance Technical Intelligence Report number 141. For starters, this report immediately addresses that the German vehicles were very carefully and cleverly disguised with the utmost attention to detail. One of the primary alterations that was made to this vehicle, which to be fair, this still stands as incredibly stupid but ultimately necessary, was to get rid of the commander's cupola. Though I have discussed it before, I shall say it again. By removing the cupola, the commander is effectively blinded when the hatches are closed, which definitely did not help in the urban fighting the vehicle would eventually encounter. One of the more minor changes that was made was the removal of the very distinctly German Panzer features, such as the hull-side external stowage for the rammer staff and tool racks. But the elements that likely took the most amount of time, and probably were the primary focus of these builds, was the sheet metal construction added to the hull, mantlet, and turret. Now, the sheet metal used on these was obviously not any kind of substantial material. They didn't use armor steel. As the report indicates, the metal on the upper bow and turret was only 3/22 of an inch thick, and the hull sides being 9/64 of an inch thick. What is interesting is the lower bow was apparently never properly measured for some reason, possibly due to damage, or it's simply slipping people's minds at the time, though the report guesses the metal on the lower part of the bow was likely thicker, or even made of double plates, which would make sense seeing as it would be an area likely exposed to a lot of contact. Now we're going to take the time to break each individual element down. The turret was disguised using 5 pieces of sheet metal, with the 2 largest pieces being used to imitate the distinct side profiles of the turret of the M10 Wolverine. This false turret featured lifting rings, brackets, and extra armor studs, which could be found on the turret of the M10 and, quote, were carefully duplicated and welded to the false turret. Now here is where we get to blow the lid off of every portrayal of this vehicle that currently exists. According to the report, the back of the turret of the Ersatz M10 was made using 2 pieces of sheet metal, with one representing the slanted bottom surface of the turret and the other representing the counterweight. What this means is that every single model you see of this tank with the upper back half of the turret open is wrong, and is based on the lack of additional information provided by this report. But here's the best part. There is a photo that exists that proves that there was the additional plate originally fitted on the upper half of the turret, thus proving that what the report says is true. Model companies everywhere, rejoice, you can now sell an updated kit with the correct turret. 3D modelers everywhere? I mourn for you. Now, the mantlet was another area that got a lot of special attention, especially in this report, as it is described as being, and I quote, carefully formed to the exact shape of the M10 gun shield, this being particularly well done. This fake mantlet, also like the fake turret, received the same correct lifting brackets as well. Now there's one addition that did kind of spoil that excellent workmanship, which was a hole was made in the mantlet for the coaxial MG34 machine gun, which needless to say, an M10 Wolverine doesn't have a coaxial machine gun. Now when it comes to the bow, yet again incredible attention to detail was displayed. The false bow, being made of approximately 4 pieces of sheet metal, was carefully contoured around the distinctly German angular lower hull of the Panther to closely match the front drive sprocket housing of the M10 Wolverine. The only minor issue with this was yet again the Germans didn't want to give up the usage of the machine gun, so a rectangular hole with a cover plate was cut in the upper bow. This issue honestly wouldn't be so bad as long as the flap was kept shut, as it could be easily mistaken for either patchwork or not even even really noticed at a distance. Another one of the major changes that was made to the hull was the inclusion of a false rear, which was made out of sheet metal and mimicked the overhanging back end of the M10 quite well. As the report points out, the only minor problem here with this disguise was the holes which permitted the standard Ponter exhaust elbows to run through it. On the actual M10 Wolverine, the exhaust exits downward, angled below the overhang. An interesting addition, surprisingly not mentioned here in the report, is the fake travel lock fitted on the engine deck. Yet another one of those small details that really heightens the entire deception. Now, the sides of the Ponter were also not left untouched, as to further increase the deception, a large single sheet of metal was attached to the sides of the vehicle, which ran parallel to the ground, to which a second sheet was attached to it, which was mounted vertically, in order to give the appearance of low-skirting armor. In all truthfulness, this was probably the weakest part of the whole deception, as the plates noticeably jut out from the sides of the vehicle more like fenders, and they do not bevel inward like they do on the actual M10. Some other notable additions onto the hull for appearance sake include the addition of spare track mounts, the same extra armor studs on the upper bow, the obligatory lifting brackets, and even fake tow cable hooks on the lower bow. To top off the disguise, the vehicles were finished in a new coat of what the report simply describes as olive drab. Unfortunately, this lack of specificity does cause some questions. Was it painted using captured paint stocks? Was it a special paint mixed by the Germans to imitate US olive drab? Or did the Germans simply use their own standard olive green paint? Sadly, we will likely never know for certain. Now, the markings still stand as being an area where the research people apparently slacked off. The stars were fine for the most part, aside from putting aerial identification stars on the roof. M10 Wolverines are open top, so it's probably not a good idea to highlight the fact the vehicle has a roof that shouldn't actually be there. Granted, this could be potentially hand-waved away as a field improvisation, as troops in the field had already been improvising roofs for such vehicles. The major mistake comes in the divisional markings. As pointed out in the original video, the markings of the 5th Armored Division were applied to these vehicles. The major problem with this was the vehicles were deployed to the Malmedy area, despite the actual 5th Armored Division being 100 to 120 miles north in the Condé-Lorraine sector. Now, despite all of this work, there were some issues which could not be easily fixed on the Ersatz M10 and just had to be left as is. First being that horrifically distinct interweaving double torsion bar suspension. What's interesting is the report has a footnote which describes the suspension as being somewhat similar to the M18 gun motor carriage. I don't know how much freedom juice someone had been intaking when they made this observation, but I guess it is what it is. Granted, that's still a mile away from the M10 Wolverine suspension. Next was the muzzle brake, which despite what a certain game company thinks, could not be removed without causing a lot of problems with the gun's recoil system when firing. The report does point out, though, that the US Army did have vehicles in service at the time with muzzle brakes fitted. But the one element that not even the report could provide any kind of potential help for was the tracks, which were incredibly wide, and as the report describes, distinctive. But I know what you're thinking, table. How does this change the overall assessment of the vehicle? Why are you suddenly no longer laughing about how bad of a deception it is? For one simple reason. Point number 11 of this report, which states, and I quote, "It is believed that had the enemy employed these disguised tanks in the proper tactical situation and at the proper time, much damage might have resulted." Unfortunately for the German engineers and mechanics who labored away making these disguised vehicles, heavy traffic, bad weather, and bad outcomes at the front meant these vehicles would ultimately have their stars covered and be sent into combat as worse vehicles than they would have been normally. When it comes to how many of the Ersatz M10s were produced, there appears to still be a lot of questions surrounding that statistic. There are only pictures of 3 positively identified vehicles and a few still unidentified vehicles. The report lists 4 known vehicles. B4, of which there seems to be no positively identified pictures of, B5, B7, and B10. The report states this number sequence may or may not indicate that 10 such vehicles were disguised. Though there may not have ever been 10, it is potentially true that 10 may have been the original planned count, but the other required vehicles were either never delivered or never completed. But now let's take a moment to speculate on something. What if they would have been used in their intended purpose of penetrating American lines and causing chaos and confusion? Well, one thing that would have been on the German side was the general inexperience of a lot of American troops in the area. Many of these guys were replacements and had not seen actual heavy fighting yet and hadn't gotten familiar with how to spot things easily at a distance. The sight of olive drab stars and the vague outline of something that looked like an M10 would probably be enough to get him to let his guard down for several crucial minutes. Bad weather would have also aided the Germans, as the snow blowing around in the air would have helped to obstruct the vehicle from clear view, and any snow or mud that built up on the vehicle, particularly around the suspension, could have helped hide the uncamouflaged elements. Another element that would have likely helped was having German troops traveling with or even on the vehicle dressed in American uniform. By having these disguised troops around the vehicle, it likely would have helped sell the idea that this was an American tank. The general chaos of the breakthrough could have also aided in explaining why these American tanks were coming from the direction they were approaching from, as many American units were forced to fall back due to the haste of the German advance, and a lot of times this occurred in a rather haphazard manner. Now, I want to do something here that I've never done before, and I apologize if this is corny, but please bear with me. Imagine you're an American soldier near Malmedy, and in the midst of this heavy snowfall, you see coming through the fog a vehicle bearing your typical American markings, wearing your typical American olive drab, with the outline of what looks to be one of your typical American M10 Wolverines. Then you notice something is off. The vehicle is stopping, and he's swinging his gun around to your position. Suddenly, a shot is fired at your position from the M10. Almost immediately, the radio man in the squad is trying to raise the M10 to tell him to cease fire, but there is no response, and instead it continues firing. Worst yet, the GIs who were previously riding on the back of it have dismounted and are also firing at you. Try to imagine the fear and confusion such a thing like that would cause. Even if this was only a one-time thing, the paranoia would be enormous, and once rumors would start spreading about the Germans using American tanks, true horror would reveal itself. From then on, every anti-tank gunner, every bazooka team, every rifleman with a grenade would be suspicious of anything olive drab with stars, and in the confusion, some American tanks could have been fired upon or even destroyed out of sheer terror. There would have been attempts to train GIs in the field how to spot these fake M10s, but conditions in the field would still be a hindrance, as a lot of times you don't have the luxury of going through a checklist point by point. Well, thankfully for every Allied soldier on the Western Front, the actual attempt to use these vehicles ended in such failure that the Germans seemingly never attempted it again. And if we're being honest, there was a big problem with Operation Greif. Though the Ersatz M10s may have been a decent attempt to mimic an American tank, its infiltrating counterparts were anything but. The most infamous example being the Ersatz Stug. To this day, nobody really knows what this thing was trying to be. Some people have tried to say that it's intended to mimic the M7 Priest, but this could not be any further from an M7 Priest, especially with the addition of those unique low side skirts and that very odd engine deck covering. The strangest part is it more closely resembles the American T-28 Super Heavy than an M7 Priest, but this is certainly purely coincidental, and has likely been pointed out elsewhere, a case where it was simply the Germans trying to break up the familiar Stug outline. Another comical example is this photo here, which shows a regular old Stug 3 without any additional camouflaging other than an olive drab respray and a lot of white stars. The idea with this could have been, as Char Asnable 3 on the War Thunder forum pointed out, which was to possibly mimic a vehicle captured by the Americans, as the overabundance of stars does genuinely mimic the markings seen on actual American-captured German vehicles at the time. But honestly, this is probably doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it was more than likely a case where the Germans simply did this in a feeble attempt to get someone not to shoot at it in 0.4 seconds. So, in conclusion, or some other fancy thesis outro type of dialogue, no, the Ersatz M10 was not a completely stupid endeavor like I made it out to be in the past. It was a carefully thought out and, considering the circumstances, well-executed attempt at making an M10 out of a Panther. The vehicle was ultimately let down not by its own workmanship, but by the failure of the planners behind its deployment. Well, that'll about do it for this here video. I hope that you all have enjoyed it, despite the rather, I guess you could say, lazy nature of covering something that I've technically already covered. For me, it ultimately comes down to the old video was so terrible and bad that I frankly had to do a do-over. Anyway, enough yammering, time to appreciate you incredible individuals. So I just want to give a special shout out here to the YouTube members, which we have Lord Hoth 4443 of the Table Size Collective. And then, oh my goodness, we have seen a population explosion in the Monochrome. We have 4 new members, Cellathroned and Deputy Rat. We've got the Bloody Band 1413 and Max 653-7. Thank you so much for your support, and the continuing support of Dragon Butt, and also Vaki Zaraki. And over on Patreon, we can't forget the absolute legend, Bombird205, as well as Spent Brass, who are also members of, yet again, the Monochrome. I did this bit in the last video, I can't go doing that. Anywho, if you wish to support me, you can support me either over here on YouTube or on Patreon. I also have a Discord server, which I, yet again, definitely totally keep up with. But anyway, I have been babbling and rambling and all sorts of inging for quite a amount of some time, so I shall now depart for the 5th Dimension Walgreens. So, take care everyone, God bless, and until next time, bye I guess?